Chapter 12, Part 1. We're going to start with a feminist image from the Guerrilla Girls. This is a cooperative group of feminist women that protested the lack of female artwork in the museums, throughout history, but they were active in the 80s and 90s, formed like from all the feminist groups in the 60s and 70s, but they focused mostly on the art world. I don't know who they actually are. I think they told who they were more recently, and I can't recall. So a little bit over the top with our gorilla face and just, trying to get your attention with this yellow and black. But this statement is factual that there were only 5% of artists in the modern art sections in the Metropolitan Museum, and then 85% of the nudes are female. So there's a couple things that we get into in this chapter and throughout art history. One is the male gaze and how a lot of these odalisques, which we've looked at in the book, nude females. This is a harem female from Morocco, fantasized about. This is a 19th century piece. Ong, I think, is our artist. But anyway, and they put their gorilla head on it. They wore the masks, by the way, just to not identify themselves for persecution. The art world can be very vindictive. So anyway, commenting on how men are looking at naked women, and we have seen a shift. And I would say, you could refer to popular movies. If you look at movies from the 80s and 90s, you see a lot more female nudity, sex scenes that focus on women, and a lot less men. And now you see a lot more thoughtful, I would say, minimal sex, I think, by comparison in movies today, HBO included. But when you do see it, it's focused more on the man. So that's kind of interesting. Things have changed a bit. Of course, we have a ways to go, but we're going to look into persons that this was their manifesto here. All persons are born with race and gender characteristics, class, standing, and genealogy that will affect their lives. And these characteristics contribute to personal identity, but on the downside, they may also trigger prejudice and discrimination. Art reflects these issues. So that's kind of where they're coming from. And I think our art historian Lazari is a bit on this side of things. And some of the images we'll look at will deal with some of those issues. Okay. So Chagall is one of our first artists that we look at, Marc Chagall. And he was originally from Russia, and he moved to France. And he is making this piece. Well, I won't skip ahead. So when we're dealing with race and art, that's our topic for the first segment, subheading race and art. And then we get into art that promotes ethnic history and values. That's our subheading down here. So he's examining the history and he is promoting it. So he's talking about at the turn of the 19th century to the 20th, Russian Jews were considered outsiders. They were kind of, European Jews were in World War I. We're not talking World War II, World War I. Were forced to go to Russia. Russia did not want them, and they were only allowed to live in certain areas, and they were restricted from attending universities, and they were subjected to anti-Semitic terrorism. So a lot of things happen during this time frame. Late 19th, early 20th century was a very rough time for the Jewish people, particularly in Europe and Russia. So there's a lot of history there. But at any rate, he is thinking about this movement of this thousands of people, and he signifies this by one figure floating up here with a knapsack. So we're not identifying this person as a single individual, but this is a group of people. So he's got this large mass, this large shape, right? So he's a big person and he is as big as the house is, because we can tell by the overlapping here that he's meant to be overly large. So Chagall is a whimsical artist. He often does a figure floating such as this, and he's sort of getting into the folk tales and celebrations, but he wants to tell this story in a particular way, where it's personal and yet it includes his people, and he reorders experience a little bit. So this is sort of imaginative. So he's recreating a village life at the turn of the century, and he's not, I wouldn't say idealizing it, but there isn't any problematic situation happening here. And one thing you should note with surrealism, which he's not exactly a part of, he's his own guy, but he crosses over into cubism in the front of this. He crosses into the Fauvists in the back over here. But he has this figure that's floating over here, and that has some similarities to surrealism. Surrealism is dream imagery, and if you think about when you're flying in a dream, it's usually because you want to get away from something. So it's escapism in a sense, like the Jews are safely getting away from the situation, and they're also rootless because they were never treated as regular citizens in Russia. So he's floating away. Very different piece. We have a photograph from James Van Der Zee, Society Ladies. So this is in the Harlem Renaissance, which is in the 20s in Harlem, New York, and upper Manhattan at the end of the island, north end of the island. And he photographed intellectuals, merchants, writers who demanded full participation in U.S. culture and politics. If you look at the 20s, I forget how many images we have on this. Okay, if you look at the 1920s and 30s, this is right before the Great Depression in 29. But if you look at this time frame, there was a lot of progress made in the U.S. This is, almost 100 years ago now. But things were really moving forward. There was a lot of good interaction, middle class support for different ethnicities. There was a good unionization effort to happen to pay everybody an equal wage. There was a lot of things that happened, but that got destroyed to some degree because of the Great Depression. There was a lot of infighting and a lot of, racism peaked back up because jobs were scarce. And that's one of the first things that happened. You should note that historically, when times are tough, people look to anybody who they want to pick on somebody, right? So a lot of these good works fell apart for quite a while, and nothing really gains ground again until the 60s in terms of civil rights. It's kind of amazing to think 30 some years go by before progress is made again. But there was the Harlem Renaissance. There were a lot of amazing writers, artists, musicians, and so on. And merchants, of course. We don't really think too much about that in the book because we're focusing on art. But there were a lot of people at the time that were doing quite well from different backgrounds. And we have our African American ladies here in a very nice home. And so the idea is to show that they're a part of the U.S. culture as much as anybody else, and that they're dressed as nicely and posed in such a way as you would see sort of really almost like a 19th century or even earlier painting of a family, just beautifully done here. So it's showing their confidence, humor, directness, wistfulness, and he was influenced by movies and encouraged sitters to take poses from the films. But, films are influenced by painting. So anyway, that you get that sense of how they wanted to express their personalities. So art can promote the status and create a positive perception of a racial group. Now, you've seen already in the book, and you know this probably from popular culture too, that there are different schools of thought where you should only project a positive image, and you shouldn't talk about any of the difficulties. You should only show the things that are going right. It's one school of thought. And some schools of thought are we got to show the ugly truth all the time, and we got both both accomplish certain things, if you want to say, but in different ways. So a lot of people have a conflict about this type of image, thinking it's overly idealized, and then other people would have a conflict with where we're going next with our Aunt Jemima image, which is over the top and pointing at all the negativity about the African American life and the history within the U.S. So different takes on this. Artists are really allowed to do anything they want, to be quite honest with you, in terms of how they want to approach a subject. Betty Saar is another African American artist, and she actually lives in Los Angeles. I actually worked with her daughter, Allison Saar, and Allison is a huge sculptor as well. Betty Saar broke a lot of ground. This particular piece is very famous. Many people know about it, have seen it, and it's in most all the textbooks. I teach from 3 textbooks. It's in all 3. So this is Aunt Jemima, The Liberation of Aunt Jemima. And when I was younger, a kid, I recognized this image very well. These are literally labels from syrup that you would get at the store. You'd have your cereal aisle and where the syrups would be. And Aunt Jemima was a very popular syrup. The image changed over the years, but this is, what is this, 1972? This is a late 60s image of Aunt Jemima, and she's smiling in a kind of a normal, middle-class kind of a way. But when she was first brought into the culture, this is how she was portrayed. So there's a couple things happening here. Talking about all these different images. Uncle Tom, Little Black Sam. Uncle Tom is a literary character, Uncle Tom's Cabin, but it refers to somebody who is playing along with the white master. Little Black Sambo, another stereotyped American figure. There are more. Brer Rabbit's another one. So she incorporated them into these collages, and she was making a provocative statement of protest. Okay, we're going to get a little more into it here. So over 150 years, there have been these dolls and toys and salt shakers and bells. There's Slave Bell. There's all kinds of things. You would ring it for service. There's all kinds of imagery that existed over time. And one thing that just seemed really outrageous is to use this as and Uncle Ben's rice. That was the other one I was trying to think of. Aunt Jemima was syrup. Uncle Ben was rice. So those were used to promote this sense of the aunt or the mammy, and which was a servant. Now, mammy would be just kind of an all-purpose personal servant, but it evolved out of slavery. So it was very negative, and she decided to make fun of that figure, and she has a couple of guns, and then she's got the black power fist here, so she's ready to fight this, and some African cloth down here. So she's incorporating all these images to provoke and to have a discussion. Oh yeah, and the cotton down here as well. Oh, and this is a mixed media box, very similar to Joseph Cornell, who we looked at. So there's a lot of degrees of different things in here. Look this over in the regular Power